I'm Carly Green and I'm a horticulturist here at the National Botanic Garden of Wales. We're a national institution who are dedicated to promoting biodiversity and educating people across Wales about the importance of plants and nature. I look after the Welsh Native Plants project, which looks to conserve some of the rarest species of plants in Wales. And so I'm really interested in protecting peatlands and peat bogs because these habitats can have some really interesting and rare species growing in them. As well as this, peat bogs are crucial for locking up carbon from our atmosphere and help to protect the entire planet against the harmful effects of climate change. We use exclusively peat-free compost. We don't use any peat anywhere on site. Mostly we use a compost that is a mixture of bark and coir. That's quite fine and quite loose, and we use that for everything from your regular garden plants that anyone can buy from a garden centre right up to our really specialist rare stuff that we collect from places like Vietnam or Tasmania or even parts of Wales that has really endangered species. But there's also other types of peat-free compost that we have here that we do use. For example, there is one that is based on composted bracken and wool, and that is really good to use on our borders out in the wider garden as a mulch because it's very moist and it's very rich. And then there's another type here that I've got that is a lot finer, that is mostly bark and vermiculite that we also use occasionally in our plant sales. So you use peat-free compost in exactly the same way that you'd use your regular peat-based compost. So just like your multi-purpose compost, you can mix it with various things like grit or perlite if you need more drainage, or you can mix a bit of food in there. And it actually can be a lot more effective than using peat for your plants, because if you've ever bought a plant that is potted in peat before, if it's allowed to dry out, you might have found that when you've gone to water it, all the water's kind of bubbled up and just rolled off the surface and not soaked in. And that is what peat does. Whereas with this, it doesn't do that as much. If you let it dry out, you can just water it as normal and it will eventually soak in, which is a lot better for your plant. The main thing I've heard from people that are adamant that they have to use peat is that they believe that they can't grow their carnivorous plants without peat, or sometimes people believe that they can't grow acid-loving plants like azaleas and rhododendrons without peat. We actually grow both of those types of plants here. For the azaleas and the heathers and the things that love acid soil, we buy a peat-free ericaceous mix. And then for our carnivorous plants, we use a very low nutrient peat-free mix that is the compost I was talking about earlier, sometimes with some loam and some grit, and they are quite happy in that as well. Because a lot of peat-free alternatives are still being developed, they can be more expensive than the peat-based multi-purpose compost you normally buy. How I get around this in my own garden at home is I like to buy the green waste compost that is offered by the council in most places. You can either get this for free from the tip or for a very low price per bag. And this is made from all of your kitchen scraps that you throw out for curbside recycling in your little caddy. And then for my small plants at home, I will mix this green waste compost with coir, which is a byproduct of the coconut food industry. And you can buy it as compressed dry blocks that once you soak expand to a vast amount of coir. And I mix the two together and that creates a really nice medium for growing anything I like to grow at home, like your vegetables and your annuals and your other flowers. A useful tip when you're first starting to grow your own plants is that plants actually need a lot less nutrients than you think they do a lot of the time. So especially for seeds and cuttings, quite often you'll see a compost marketed as seed and cutting compost, and that will have a lot less nutrients in it. because when you sow a seed, all of the food that the seed needs is already enclosed within it. So all they really need is something to get their roots into. So for this reason, we often use just straight up coir for our seeds, and for our cuttings a lot of the time we use pure perlite, because they have everything that the young plant needs to get its first roots out and nothing more. Also, when you then pot those young plants up, again, you don't want to suddenly put them in a very rich, wet compost, because it will just be too much for them. So what we will also do then is you can mix your very rich, lovely peat-free compost, or even your homemade compost, with coir to dilute it so that it's not too overpowering for the young plant. When you're watering your peat-free plants, you want to water them very similarly to how you would with your normal multi-purpose compost. When you come to your plants, just look at the soil and check that first. So a good tip I like to say is to stick your finger up to the first knuckle into the soil of the plant, and if it comes out damp, then your plant's probably fine. If it comes out dry, it's probably best to water it. When you're buying your compost, it's actually quite easy to check that what you're buying doesn't have any peat in it. Most of the time, the bags will have peat-free written quite prominently on them because it's quite a good selling point. So as long as your compost says peat-free on the front of it, then it's quite safe to use. A lot of companies will say reduced peat on their bags, and this actually means that it does still contain peat, so you'd be better off looking for an alternative. So what's really encouraging is that once people learn about the damaging effects of peat harvesting, they're really willing and really passionate about finding alternatives. And here at the Botanic Gardens, if we can find alternatives for all of the different species that we grow, then it should be really easy for you at home to join in.